how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer podcast. I appreciate you joining me on another album review. It's been some time. I wait too long between album reviews now. I don't know what's up with that, but episode 73. We have a special one today. We're going to be reviewing the latest album from indie rock vets, legends, if you will, Arctic Monkeys, with the album titled The Car. I believe this is the seventh one from the band on Domino Records. So yeah, just excited to cover this for you. I appreciate all the listens between now and then. The last episode, of course, was like the Lizzo album review. I think I surprised myself a bit on that review just because I probably gave it a better score than I probably thought I would have. But nonetheless, check it out if you're interested in my my thoughts on her latest album, Special. And then, of course, we have the last episode of the podcast was an episode of Talking Tracks. Thanks to everyone that listened to it. It was a bit lengthy. I believe I covered the month of March on there. So overall, some cool tracks that from artists like Girl in Red, Men I Trust, The Arcs, Blink-182. If you haven't heard, they got back together with Tom DeLonge. Dry Cleaning, and appreciate everyone taking a listen on that one. But of course, if you're interested, episodes right before this one, we'll just go ahead and dive into the review. But before we get started, actually, I lied. We're still going to be doing Talking Tracks for, I guess, the year of 2022. Next one lined up is April. It is taking me a while to put them out, but I should have some more time as the year ends. And, of course, Talking Tracks, since it kind of follows the Billboard Hot 100, more than likely I'm not going to be covering the month of December for this year, just because it gets infiltrated with basically Christmas music now until Christmas. So we're essentially in the week of Thanksgiving now. I'll just put my best foot forward and say, let's try to at least make it till the end of the Billboard year, which I believe cuts off sometime around now. If we get to like some sort of Christmas episode, I've done some Christmas episodes in the past, but who knows? It's up in the air. But anyways, and I don't mind putting out the episodes of Talking Tracks kind of late-ish, just because it kind of seems like it's more of like a retrospect sort of show now, and it seems to be doing okay, and basically doing it that way, just because, I mean, I'm putting out recent tracks on the first half of the episode, and then just talking about a month, going back to it is kind of fun. In this case, we'll go back to April. We'll see what the hell was going on in April. And there's some weird shit that's been happening thus far on the Billboard Hot 100. So not to bore anyone about that stuff, but let's go ahead and get to this Arctic Monkeys review. All right, so this is going to be, I believe, the seventh full-length album from the band Arctic Monkeys. If you're not familiar with them, they've been around for a while. They formed in 2002 in Sheffield, England. So about 20 years now. I feel like it's appropriate that they released an album this year. It's been 20 years since the formation. And the band has kept quite a consistent lineup, mainly comprised of four members. Nowadays, they kind of have like permanent-ish touring members. It seems like every album cycle they add more and more, probably because the band has just more and more money as time goes on. Of the four members, the exception being Andy Nicholson, that left the initial lineup after the first album came out in 2006. After having some sort of injury. They always say it was an injury, why he left the band, and that Nick O'Malley came in on to fill in on the tour. But, the injury must have been pretty bad for Andy Nicholson, because what I've always heard was that it was like some sort of hand injury, which, hand injuries don't last typically 20 years. So I guess they got Nick O'Malley, and they must have really liked his chops and kind of broke it to Andy that he wouldn't be joining the band again. I always wondered how that went down, or if Andy kind of volunteered to just kind of bow out. But Nick O'Malley, of course, phenomenal bass player, great choice to keep in the band. And the band's debut is noted in history as being one of the most impressive debuts from a band as far as like rock music goes in the UK. The album debuted in 2006 and was noted as the fastest selling debut album in the UK of all time. At the time, it was that. I think they might still have that record in the UK. I'm not entirely sure, but it was impressive at the time. Mainly because the band had little to no traditional promotion or marketing. The Arctic Monkeys are primarily noted as one of the first bands to mainly be driven solely from internet hype or success. So instead of the band getting big by having their music video on MTV or radio play or intense marketing campaigns, they really spread via word of mouth, especially online. And this was a thing that happened not only to the Arctic Monkeys, but around the early 2000s, of course, as broadband internet was becoming more and more common across middle class households in Western civilization. You kind of know what happens from there. But a huge, highlight of that era was the Arctic Monkeys blowing up as a small local band from Sheffield, England, to basically international, breakout rock stars. Mainly seeing most of their hype, across the pond in the UK and Europe, but they definitely made an impact in the US, as they were coming about the first album cycle. So anyways, they won the Best Brit Award in 2007 for that debut album. They ended up keeping up the pace with actually their sophomore effort a year later, repeating that initial success with the 2007 release Favorite Worst Nightmare, with the Brit Award happening in 2008 for Best Album. Favorite Worst Nightmare, great album. Probably my favorite Arctic Monkeys album overall. I will say there is some bias in this review that I've been trying to keep out of it. But growing up, I have been a fan of the band and have listened to them quite heavily. Primarily, the album Famous Worst Nightmare has been one of my favorite albums of all time. But yeah, I mean, I will admit that the band's discography is quite consistent, in my opinion, with the third and fourth albums being quite good as well. Humbug, the third album, being released in 2009, was a significant shift for the band that featured a new level of maturity and technical playing that was in part driven by Josh Homme filling in on the production efforts on much of the album. The darkness that Arctic Monkeys was able to unlock on that album in comparison to like past albums, even some current albums, they haven't really done that again. Tracks like Jeweler's Hand and My Propeller come to mind. Just a really great album and evolution from the second, which there's obvious comparisons in sound and aesthetic between the second and third albums, I'd say, just because they didn't really change up much in regards to being just a simple rock band with two guitars, a bassist, and a drummer, and some high energy compositions and production. However, a bit of the songwriting choices and just overall, stylistic choices happened between Favorite Worst Nightmare and Humbug. And it shows on various tracks, but primarily the darker ones, like I mentioned, My Propeller and Jeweler's Hands. And just to mention, Favorite Worst Nightmare, some of the highlights on there, of course, 505, being a great one. Brian Storm, the album's loaded, Golden Bricks, I believe, there's so many of them to list, but, I'm not trying to prove myself as a fan here, but, if anyone was wondering some of the highlights, do me a favor as well. But let's move forward. Their fourth album, Suck It and See, was a bit of a confusing release for me at the time. It came out in 2011. Around that time, I remember starting to get pretty into Arctic Monkeys. I eventually became a pretty big fan of their music, with resulting in me sneaking out to see them my senior year of high school and getting in trouble doing it. But that's another story for another day. So the release of Suck It and See certainly had notable tracks. However, the album had to grow on me for years. Not until I was in college that I finally gained an appreciation of the album. But I truly came to really like certain tracks like Black Treacle, Brick by Brick, Don't Sit Down, and Pile Driver Waltz are some that come into mind. And I still enjoy listening to the album from time to time. I will say up until now, Suck It and See has probably been my least favorite Arctic Monkeys album, but, it's still a strong work overall, in my opinion. It wasn't until 2003 that I guess Arctic Monkeys saw some prominent mainstream success in the United States with the release of AM, the band's fifth and most commercially successful. When I mean prominent, I don't mean that, the average alternative rock or indie rock listener that grew up listening to music in the 2010s or just mainly the 2000s at that point. I don't mean those people, people that actively listen to music in the United States. They knew about the Arctic Monkeys more than likely. I mean prominent as in, grandmas and, church pastors were probably starting to catch wind of this band. And it was just interesting to see how fast and quick their prominence picked up. It took them up another notch, and just to keep providing more, conversation around this. They went from playing respectable sized venues for a alternative rock band or indie rock band in the U.S. to arenas in the U.S. And currently now still playing arenas in the upcoming tour they have. So it bumped them up a notch, and it kept them at that level 10 years now when they have a 2023 world tour, playing still in arenas. It kind of just shows how big that album was, and I still don't think people truly understand how big that album was in terms of like cultural relevance, commercial success, other fancy shit that I'm probably forgetting. But the album itself features a nice blend of pop, R&B, and rock that made the Arctic Monkeys' distinguishable rock sound quite accessible to the point where like teenage girls ended up being the main fan base for quite a bit of time for the band, especially during that album cycle. And I suppose given Alex Turner's overall stage presence and looks, that was bound to happen at some point. The album's success is mainly attributed to basically the lead-off single and start of the album, Do I Want to Know, which topped charts worldwide and ended up going platinum in the US. The track is still played on rock and alternative radio rotation to this day, and it still manages to fit in quite nicely, sounding, up to date at this point. It doesn't sound outdated, and it's 10 years old at this point, essentially. And just to paint a bigger picture on how big that song was, Do I Want to Know, it has 1.5 billion streams on Spotify. Now, and when you're comparing it to probably like a mainstream artist, like, I don't know, Drake, or maybe Kanye West, 1.5 billion streams probably isn't the craziest thing. But for a band like Arctic Monkeys, where, the whole entire discography has mainly been just, a lot of consistent albums that didn't have huge breakout hits, for them to have a song like Do I Want to Know be on the level of like the biggest artists in the world in terms of like how much streams they're getting, that does say something. I mean, I'm trying to look up like other big artists' numbers right now. So, I mean, just taking into consideration like a huge artist that pretty much craps on any other artist's numbers, Bad Bunny, even looking right now at, his latest streaming numbers, nothing's in the billions, other than one track that has been out for some time now called La Canción. But yeah, just to paint a picture on like probably like the pinnacle of streams ever, with Bad Bunny. The Arctic Monkeys have pulled weight in their own respect. So, yeah, just wanted to point that out there. How prominent Do I Want to Know an AM was. But that era has gone and passed. And I'd say the most impressive thing about the Arctic Monkeys is not really anything that I've mentioned thus far. It's really just their consistency to sound fresh and different upon every album release. They always bring something a little bit out of left field. The sixth album that happened between AM and The Car, Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, certainly was no exception. This album, when it came out, it certainly left behind any chance of them ever going back to an AM sound. And that's just for the foreseeable future. Of course, I don't know how long this band will go. I knock on wood, I hope they go on for as long as they can. In terms of the sound of between AM and Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, it's a bit of a mouthful. And just to point out the drastic nature between AM and Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, if we can just like paint an image, AM is like a nice nightclub with all the hip and most sexiest people in town, and everyone there is just popular and rich, and they know it and successful. And then Tranquility Base Hotel is a dive bar that has a few people in there that all hate themselves and probably live in their own little world. And also, there's like this weird, uncool, gothic vampire theme that no one seems to get. That's kind of like a bad analogy for how drastic the shift between AM and Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino is. And I think that's probably the most impressive thing about Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, because the Arctic Monkeys had that commercial success to where they were the idealistic band for the mid 2000s that other bands wanted to be. They wanted the Alex Turner frontman, they wanted the big ass hit like Do I Want to Know, and they wanted the arena tours. Granted, acts that didn't already have that. There's other big rock bands that don't need to be like the Arctic Monkeys, but certainly alternative rock bands in the mid 2000s that were not as big as, Arctic Monkeys. I think AM was essentially a blueprint. No one has ever created it again. I think there's a good reason for that, but the Arctic Monkeys ditched it, and they probably ditched it because they knew if they stuck around too long with that sound, they eventually would be seen as old and just trying to relive the past, probably. And eventually that fancy club with all the the good looking people that were successful, they'd eventually go to some other club. I'm assuming that's probably how that industry works. But the Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, to put it short, it's a spacey concept album, literally spacey. It's about space. It's about a casino in space. The opening track, Star Treatment, exemplifies just that, with a reverb soak, loungy, atmospheric nature. Alex Turner displays vast amounts of character throughout the track. The following track, 1 Point Perspective, is a track that features some agile, loose bass playing that ends up featured all throughout the album. The bass playing on this album really drives a lot of the tracks, and it keeps it interesting when it needs to be. The track is more of an upbeat and bubbly take on the album's concept. The next track, American Sports, features a seamless transition from one point perspective, and the track makes a return to the ethereal, spacey nature of the album. The track features elements such as retro-sounding synths that coat the track, along with a plethora of trippy textures on just about every instrumental. The title track is perhaps an unsung hero of this album, with the track truly encapsulating the exact nature of what this album is truly trying to accomplish. Again, this album is about a space casino with a rock star, I think, having like some sort of existential crisis. Golden Trunks was perhaps one of the worst tracks on the album in hindsight. The track is just a bit of an outlier and doesn't really connect with the rest of the album, in my opinion. 4 out of 5 is a bit of a return to form, as the track brings the listener back to the spacey and loungy nature of the album. The track also features like signature Arctic Monkeys riffs that are hooky by nature, and provide a nice base for the entire track to work on. It's perhaps the most popular track of the album cycle, I believe. And the album takes an interesting turn with like the 3 least popular tracks in sequence afterwards. Tracks like The World's First Monster Truck Front Flip, Science Fiction, and She Looks Like Fun. To note, Science Fiction does a good job in keeping tension all throughout the album and creating a dark mood that is supported by some wonky and quirky textures and instrumentals. She Looks Like Fun is a bit of a more relaxed track that takes much of the tension that was on Science Fiction and kind of just releases it. After that, we get an interesting track with Bat Phone. This track provides a much needed return to familiarity to some typical Arctic Monkeys norms, such as like some fuzzy guitars, some prominent synth organ textures, and Alex Turner's crooning. It's an interesting track overall. And then after that, we get the Ultra Cheese. It's a bit of a mid-tempo piano ballad that I think appropriately closes off this album. The track is similar in a sense to AM's number 1 party anthem in terms of aesthetic. I think perhaps it could be a little symbolic in closing the AM era that has gone and passed, as a closing statement, if you will. But nonetheless, that's kind of where we left off in 2018. Now we're here in 2022, and we have this new album called The Car. Just to be, straightforward, this album, in all respect, is probably the most different album in the entire discography for this band. It diverges completely off of any resemblance to their styles. I'd say in the first 5 albums, with, Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino having lots of similarities to this album, The Car. However, The Car is entirely on its own. If you told me, if we just swapped out Alex Turner, for another singer, I would not have thought this was an Arctic Monkeys album, which that's saying a lot, because a lot of the distinguished identifiers that you get on the typical Arctic Monkeys track, in my opinion, are a bit of like the instrumental features, such as Matt Helder's drumming, Nick O'Malley's bass playing in some points, which if we are being honest, there are some distinguishing moments that I'd say, okay, maybe Nick O'Malley does kind of put his signature twist on a lot of these tracks here in The Car. But really where this is going is that The Car essentially is, this is perhaps an Alex Turner, solo effort that Arctic Monkeys essentially, contributed to. In some regards, this is better than perhaps Alex Turner putting out this album as a solo album, without the name Arctic Monkeys, and then nobody really caring about it because it sounds a certain way and it sounds nothing like the Arctic Monkeys, as opposed to, what we got here, where the album is essentially just the band still. working through what a solo effort featuring Alex Turner would more than likely sound like. And not to get too down the rabbit hole, but a lot of these tracks are sounding like Last Shadow Puppet tracks. And I haven't mentioned Last Shadow Puppets, not because I didn't mean to mention them. I actually like a lot of Last Shadow Puppets music, but if you're new to Last Shadow Puppets, essentially Last Shadow Puppets are an Arctic Monkeys side project that just features Alex Turner and another artist called Miles Kane. That kind of came out around early on in the Arctic Monkeys career. They've had one successful full-length album and then actually another successful sophomore effort. And they have since, nobody really knows, I guess, if they ever plan on making a new album together. Some would say maybe the dynamic between Alex Turner and Miles Kane is maybe unhealthy for both individuals, but I probably won't extend on that any further. The Last Shadow Puppets have made music that essentially are less focused on a rock sound and more of a, I'd say like a vintage pop sound, with some rock elements depending on the track. And the reason why Last Shadow Puppets probably work is because both artists, Miles Kane and Alex Turner, feed off each other in terms of their levels of talent and, songwriting sensibilities. And they sound quite similar to each other when they're on a track. And that's quite impressive, actually, because I think Alex Turner perhaps has one of the more distinguishable voices in music. And for Miles Kane to kind of like blend in quite nicely on any given Last Shadow Puppets track is, I think the relationship that they make musically is, it's you can't really replicate that. But the reason I guess I'm going down this tangent is because there probably might not ever be another Last Shadow Puppets album again. And I'm sure there's a backlog of those songs that Alex Turner has. And like I said earlier, well, the other option was to maybe do a solo effort. But Alex Turner probably thought about it, considered, well, I could probably make a lot more money doing this as an Arctic Monkeys album as opposed to doing like that whole solo release awkward stage. Like, for instance, when Brandon Flowers did that with the Killers. Why did he do that? He could have just wrote most of those songs on that solo album could have just been Killer songs, especially now, the state of the band now. But that's another story. Anyways, Alex Turner said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's stupid. I'm just going to, call up the guys. They're going to probably agree because we haven't made an album in 4 years and they probably want to make some money too. And we're going to put out this album. And we're still going to kick ass in the studio. The production's going to be good. And we know how to make an album. So that's not going to be a problem. And we're going to go on tour and make some money. Now, I hate to put it in that respect because the album has a lot of merit artistically. It sounds unique. It's beautiful at some points. In a lot of points, actually. There's a lot of strings, textures going on that actually resemble, I hate to bring it up, but a lot of Last Shadow Puppets music. And I think that can be credited to their longtime producer, James Ford. I'm not even going to look it up, but if I had to guess, I'm pretty sure that's where that's coming from. I guess, without doing a review yet, because I haven't even really gotten to the review, if we were to get a Alex Turner solo effort, it would probably sound a bit like this. And if we're just being pretty honest here, Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino did kind of allude a bit to Alex Turner's solo effort, just mainly because of how focused the tracks were on his lyrics and vocals, and just the style that came about from it. Not as much of a focus on guitars, if we're being honest. And it seems just kind of like the natural progression of the band is to stay away from the focal point on the music being, those signature guitar riffs that made them so distinguishable in their album cycles early on, like the first two albums where, you can sing back the riff to Teddy Picker or Brainstorm, just to name a couple. And, you know, they've kind of just, now they've gotten to the point where they're just making, you know, rock songs or soft rock songs, indie rock songs, whatever you will, that, you know, require a little bit more layer. They require a bit more layer than just throwing on, you know, a guitar riff, a bass line, a drum pattern, and then some, you know, fast, energetic vocals from Alex Turner. Naturally, the music as it progresses tend to probably favor more of like a solo Alex Turner sound. And yeah, so that's the main point. It took me a while to make that point, but that's probably the main theme on this album. But there are details on this album that are worth noting. Starting from the first track, There Better Be a Mirror Ball. There'd Better Be a Mirror Ball. This is a bit of an interesting track. There's a thematic opening with strings, piano, and some muffled bass. I love the fuzzy ostinato synth melody. It just kind of coats the track and gives it this pleasing nature overall. The piano's richness can be nice and warm all throughout the track. There's this ride cymbal drum pattern that goes on the track. You know, that can become a little trancy. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It kind of just gives the track some style. The bass can have some interesting and fat sounding moments, and that's kind of an occurrence that happens a bit. That just kind of helps these tracks have some weight to them. And it can be a little uneasy hearing Alex go into like a higher falsetto register that hasn't really been heard that often in the discography, but it's executed quite well for what it is, though. And I like the track overall. After that, we get another track titled I Ain't Quite Where I Think I Am. This track features more of like a steady, rigid nature. There's a signature wah pedal funk guitar hook that kind of just gives the track an interesting flavor. There is a bit of like a funk influence on this album from time to time. Not sure about some of the writing here on this track. Alex's crooning can feel a bit unsteady at times as well. The backing vocal antidotes are pretty good when they hit, though. I really wish we saw more of that all throughout the project. It's an interesting track. There are some lovely string arrangements that show up on some points in the verses that kind of show up when they're truly needed to give the track a bit more flavor. But the track does go on a bit too long. I'd say that's probably a downfall of this track and some other tracks as well. Sculpture of Anything Goes. This is a cool track. I like the heaviness of it. It's like an evolved Do I Want to Know from like another time and place. There's some nice colorful synth bits. Nice attitude overall coming from Alex on here as well. On his vocal delivery. It's an interesting track. The track builds up to like some climatic moments that do end up paying off. And then the track also features some nice synth swells that I think that kind of blend in nicely. Jet Skis on the Moat. I tried really liking this track. However, I'd say this is another track that suffers from a really long runtime. The track is definitely a slow burner. And it can sound a bit aimless at times, especially in the interlude sections that we get. There are some interesting qualities, like there's a nice piano that provides a bright warmness to the track, and there is a pronounced thickness to the bass on here that punches through a lot of the track that gives us some life, but I don't think it's enough here to kind of like resurrect the track. Essentially, the track's a little bit of dead on arrival. Body Paint is a nice highlight, though. Afterwards, I love the thematic synth melody that opens up this track. This is an example of Alex's vocals sounding a bit strained or perhaps near the limits of his vocal range. He kind of just pulls it off just enough, I think. And this track is quite different for AM, especially in the songwriting with the exposed musical theater inspired bridge section. There's some nice breakdowns as well that come about right before we get back to the A section. And then also like some classic AM-esque guitar lines towards the end. And then also some classic Arctic Monkeys type guitar lines towards the end of the climatic sections that are almost like Josh Homme inspired in a sense. And there is a bit of a payoff, as the track reaches the refrain, the body paint refrain towards the end, that I think it just gives the track enough strength to be consistent. After that, with the car, this is definitely a interesting one as well. Love the captivating opening with the organic instrumentation, with the finger pluck guitar riffs. There's some interesting spaced out auxiliary percussion at times. It's a very patient track. It doesn't try to head anywhere too soon. And this one's more of like a Last Shadow Puppet slow burner, if you will. I'd say this is probably most similar to like what I was mentioning earlier, being, some, maybe left on the table Last Shadow Puppets tracks. And, the track wasn't bad. I feel as if it could have been a little bit more developed. There's like a nice dark haunting color, with a brief interlude section featuring a grimy guitar solo. I think if, those features were hit on a little bit harder, the track would have been a little bit better. After that, we get Big Ideas. Here we have like this smooth vintage R&B flavor on the track and a gritty bass tone that fits in quite nicely with the mix. It's also a bit meta in the lyrics, as I would like, but it's an interesting take. There's a mention of a band playing with an orchestra. So that's kind of what this track is. There's a lovely string arrangement to it. I'd say the tempo is perhaps a bit too sluggish. That's kind of like the biggest glaring issue I think I had on this track. Hello You. This was a highlight. There's a hooky melodic theme in the intro that is reiterated over the course of the track. That's a nice touch. I love the overall punchiness and attitude of the track. The auxiliary hand percussion that brings flavor to this. There's a hooky melodic material on the chorus section that just makes the track stand out nicely. There's string arrangements that line up quite nicely and beautifully with the rest of the composition, especially on some subtle melodic bits that mirror Alex's vocals. And then also a call and response from, a lot of vocals and then strings, or vocals and then instrumental. This was definitely probably my favorite, or one of my favorite tracks on this album. I feel the album would have been a bit stronger if they kind of just hit on more of these ideas presented in Hello You. After that, we get, unfortunately, a bit of a head scratcher, Mr. Schwartz. This sounds like a bit of like a Radiohead inspired In Rainbows deep cut that was not good enough to be on that album. There's a bit of tension that I think is nice on this track as it builds up, but there's just like an awkward sequence where the track tries to get dancey at some point with some odd and thin sounding percussion textures that totally don't fit the track, and in my opinion don't really improve the track at all either. So this track had some compositional issues that I don't really understand what the point overall that they're trying to hit on. It even sounds a bit odd in context of the album. And then after that, we're kind of left with the last track, Perfect Sense. I'd say this is an interesting end to the album as well. It's probably the most unique sounded Arctic Monkeys track I've ever heard. It's not guitar centric at all. Any guitar is put quite far back in the mix. Much of the energy and momentum of this track is brought to you by a string arrangement that plays quarter notes throughout the whole entire track, and it's very Last Shadow Puppets-esque, and it's a bit dreamy. It just doesn't really hit all too hard on the aesthetic I think it was trying to go for, or just compositionally. Again, it's short-lived. It doesn't really go anywhere significant, I think, and unfortunately it's just a bit of a confusing end to this album, which overall is a bit confusing. I did find some highlights. I do appreciate a lot of the material that's on here, and I think there's a lot of potential on here. Now, what I'm hoping could perhaps happen, this is the bias in me, is that this album will just end up growing on me, kind of just how, like, it took me a while for it to grow on me with Suckin' and See. But in terms of like a long term sound for this band, for Arctic Monkeys to continue to go with, um, I'd say I just don't see it happening. And if they did continue to develop this sort of weird Alex Turner crooning solo effort, um, it kind of begs the question, well, then what is the rest of the band really doing when they're writing? um, of course they're recording and, contributing to writing parts, but at some point, producers and studio musicians can do that stuff. But I have confidence that this band always comes out swinging and a unique direction, and who knows, the next album could be a hip hop country fusion sort of deal, or maybe like a straight up metal album, which would be cool actually. But who knows? Overall, though, probably one of the weaker albums in their discography. In my opinion, the weakest. I'm feeling, in terms of rating, a 5 out of 10. Just because, there is a lot of potential on here. There was a track like Hello You where I was really pulling for the album to kind of like head more in that direction, but late in the track listing, it was apparent that wasn't going to happen. And at that point, it is what it is. I don't think this album is really meant for a lot of their audience at this point. I think a lot of Arctic Monkeys fans are gonna struggle to like this, and if they do, stay open-minded, it's probably gonna be the ones that are generally more into different styles of music and have stuck around with the band long enough to respect that they're gonna make creative choices that are a bit different from what they've done in the past. But the casual fans that want to hear more of what they've done before, even to the point of Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino. If I really liked Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino, and listening to it again, I like the album. But if I really enjoyed that album and I thought, it was one of the best albums that the Arctic Monkeys made, and I heard The Car, I would be quite disappointed, and I probably wouldn't give any consideration to The Car. So yeah, and in terms of like a general audience, I don't really know who this is for, where this album is hitting in terms of like, is it for is it for an old audience? It's definitely not for a young audience. This album, if it's going to have any success, it's going to appeal to like, people that are well into their life. And then in terms of, genre wise, this isn't a rock album, for the most part. This is, this could be trying to hit on like the indie head listener that, perhaps dabbles in a little bit of, Thundercat. Since this doesn't really hit on like a general rock fan, it's just interesting on who would pick this up. I know in retrospect now I remember Pitchfork really loved this, and it kind of makes sense that this album would probably be going more in an artsy direction, and it probably wants listeners that are patient enough to listen to something like this. I did get a text from a friend the other day asking me my opinion on this album, which I thought was a bit surprising, but now that I look back on it, the guy was very into funk in college, so kind of see why he might have thought, this album was a bit interesting. But yeah, if this album does get a niche audience, or if it is, regarded as an under the radar classic years from now, I'd actually be quite pleased by that, and maybe that will happen. But a bit of an interesting, just release in general. I'm indifferent, essentially. The fan in me is disappointed, but I guess the person with the podcast is just kind of indifferent. So yeah. But if you got to the end of this review, I know it's a bit lengthy. Thanks for sticking around. We'll try to get some more episodes out as the year ends, and I appreciate you guys listening. Take care of yourselves. See you.